Yes. So this is going to be a discussion, so I hope people are joining in. So event type categorization. I thought of starting with showing what we have today. So in the sepia, our architecture implementation proposal, we have a categorization of the events in different categories. We are in this picture missing one. I just wanted to point that out if you're looking, if sharp out looking for it. Excuse me. Ramm has one also, which is trying then to categorize events. Excuse me. So one of the things here, just point out that if you look in this categorization, you might find Eiffel service deployed events, so on. These are not part of the official protocol, but it's an extension that resides on the Ericsson domain, so you're aware about it. So I tried to summarize or show the difference between the sepia categorization and the Remnant categorization. So I guess the first question could be asked is, do we need such a categorization? What is your ideas here?
I think it's valuable when it comes to the Ramm use case that you showed before there with the family, and it refers back to the discussion yesterday on the routing key as well that Magnus had on the presentation, because it's if we would have a categorization related to the family definitions, that would then mean that it's easier to filter on certain specific groups of or categories of events in your binding keys when you listen to the events sent from someone. So that in that case it makes sense. Then of course when talking about the events, it also makes sense to say that, yeah, you know, these activity events, and then everyone knows what group of events you're talking about. But of course there are quite many corner casing events then that more or less just fit into one category, like the announcement event here, for example. It doesn't really fit into some other more generic grouping, so it doesn't maybe make too much sense to group those events in such categories.
To me, the problem with categorization is that they're somewhat arbitrary. In a way that doesn't necessarily make sense. For example, why is CLM in the artifact category? Who would have known? And you will frequently end up in cases where you have you're interested in events from multiple categories. So I think in just speaking about events, you might as well use sort of the first word or first two words in the event name. That would work equally well. I mean, if you say artifact event today, it's pretty obvious you're talking about artifact created, artifact published, possibly artifact reused, even though it's pretty unusual. I'm a little bit. Engineers love to categorize things, and sometimes it's useful, other times it's not. So, and I'm not saying categorizing here is not useful, but it's hard to find a universally good way of doing it. Of course, you could pick some kind of a categorization, except that it's not perfect for all purposes, and you know you're okay with that. That would certainly be an option.
Yeah, to some extent I agree with you, Magnus, there as well, that the first part of the event types could be seen as the category itself, and we don't need another categorization. But then I guess we would also need to set some kind of naming standards on our events, saying that all test-related events should be called something, Eiffel test, blah, 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 so that we don't introduce any test events with some other first parts of their event types. Then it would of course make sense to use those the naming convention more as our categorization. I agree.
But then if I get you correctly, it's more actually towards the Ramm categorization. Okay, skip CLM here, and maybe the issued events in type test might not be logical, but else it's like the basic activity events. You have artifact events. Excuse me. You have test events. We have source events, composition events, environment events, and so on. Is that the kind of idea you're thinking about?
Yeah, more or less like that, I think. If I may, I would like Thomas to leave to make some statement on based on your experience. I know, Thomas, you're the Ericsson expert in message bus federation, if nothing else. For example, I mean, what is your experience, Thomas, on the federation rules today set up within Ericsson, combined with these families or activities, or sorry, categories or whatever we talked about here?
Yeah, I mean, we are using the family a lot. It's sort of a fundamental rule that we have when creating federations, that we by default we federate all the artifact events between Eiffel domains. So in our implementation, when we set this up, we have this automated. So when a new domain is ordered and a new message bus is built, it will automatically receive artifact events from all the other Eiffel domains. So we make use of this family a lot. And I listened to Magnus yesterday when he said that it's not really needed, or you can build multiple binding keys to get what you want. And I mean, that is true, but it also means that you also need to manage all those specific binding keys per event type, for instance. So I guess it's absolutely possible, but it's just a convenient way to group them, at least for people like me. So we see one binding key with the proper family wildcard thing. Get what you want.
Yeah, I can maybe fill in there as well on the what you say, that we by default federate all artifact related events between all domains, and I guess the reason there is obviously that it should be in any, depending on regardless of what domain you're listening to or working in, it should be possible to more or less see any artifact or any new version of a product artifact then that is created anywhere else in the whole infrastructure in Ericsson in our case, and it should be totally fine to, well, as long as it's public, so to say, within the company to show these artifacts and it's not confidential or anything like that. It makes it easy to by default know when a new product is released in some area, and that's, I guess, the reason why also the confidence level modified event is in the same family. It's for convenience, I would say, because then you can also see that, okay, this artifact was created and it's published, and there is also some kind of high confidence in that the artifact is good enough. So you would get that event for free, more or less, when we just federate on the artifact family. And to not spam all the different domain message buses, we don't federate individual test events to all domains, and we don't federate the activity events to all domains, because those are huge in number. And of course, that's one of the reasons for using these families in our binding keys for federating events. Does that make any sense, Magnus, to Axis, or is it our scale that is the reason here?
I don't see us introducing domains anytime soon, I think. So I mean, at your scale, I totally see the point, definitely. But it's also setting aside the routing key. That's what I mean with sort of the categorization is rather arbitrary. So what makes sense for your federation use case might not necessarily make sense more broadly. So
I totally get that as well. I mean, it's our background that more or less forces us to use the categorization we have internally today and the federations we use. Maybe I should comment that we are looking for a more end-to-end based follow my commit. We also discussed follow my commit yesterday, and that would then mean that to be able to see all, to be able to follow a commit through the whole infrastructure, I mean through all domains in our case, then that would mean that we would need to federate the activity events as well, probably between domains, much more than what we do today, at least. So then we will have a very much higher load on our message buses when we federate those events. We need to be careful at least when doing those things. Maybe we would need to have a federation, or so follow my commit deployed in one domain and not federated everywhere else. But whatever.
I think the key here is to ensure that there's a flexibility to this. Because there will be, I mean, when you start out using Eiffel, even if, let's say, you're a medium or a large organization, the deployment's not going to be massive to begin with. And the same can be said for the Eiffel domains that are deployed within Ericsson. Sometimes there are new development teams that don't really have much use of Eiffel, of the sort of, they don't get to use much of what makes Eiffel good in the beginning. But then as they grow, it does. And then you have this position where in the beginning it's extremely helpful to have these sort of functional groupings of events to allow setup to be easy and somewhat straightforward, and to sort of facilitate whatever workflow you have without having to do, you know, really complicated in-depth configuration. But then, as time progresses, you will run into, you know, places where maybe one service that is used by one team or something along those lines will need to have very fine-tuned binding keys or routing keys to ensure that only the very specific events that this service is interested in actually gets into it, to prevent, you know, it being overloaded or it using compute resources unnecessarily. So I think there needs to be a best of both worlds here. I don't think we're really looking at one or the other, but rather how can we do this in a way that works for both a sort of starter scale and then sorry, not starter, but like a general use case for that will work mostly, and then to also support very specific use cases.
Yeah, I guess these families or categorizations mostly make sense for large-scale deployments of Eiffel. Very large scale, I would say. I mean, we have even talked in Ericsson if we should really continue using the domains as we use today, or if we should more or less have one domain only. But that's another discussion. But still, it would be good, of course, to have some kind of way to group things for federation purposes, if nothing else, and to decrease the load when binding things, and not, as Thomas was into as well, to more easily manage and configure the different routings and bindings that we need to do for all our different services, and not needing to add all individual event types, but instead using the families there. So I think that the options should still be, I mean, we have in the routing key standard now from that Magnus described yesterday, the family is there, the categorization we can use to call it is there. And then it's up to the organization deploying Eiffel to decide if they want to use it or not. But still, do we need to publish that categorization somewhere? I mean, it should be the same here in Remnant and sepia, for example. We shouldn't need to have two different categorizations if we would need to have them. And it would be good to standardize it, just as we did with the with the routing key recently. It would be good to standardize the families, so it makes more sense to talk about the different types of events then somehow.
Yeah, I agree, and especially if we get some traction with the SDKs, the mapping tables between concrete event types and the families would be built into the SDKs, and if everyone uses the SDKs, it wouldn't be a big deal. But in the current situation where there aren't any SDKs, introduction or existence of families is a nuisance. But comparing Ramm and sepia, I would say that sepia has too many categories. They're too broad. There are too many categories with just one or two events, and then there's not much point. But that categorization is done less on events, but more of pipeline actor roles. Isn't that right?
Somehow, yeah. I think that if you look at the colors instead of the boxes here, we would see more similarities between sepia and Remnant. For example, all test events that are, they are there, except for the issue verified and issue defined event, maybe then. So there's a better relation if you look at the colors instead of the boxes. So yeah, and the boxes are then, as I say, for pipeline actors more.
I have a question here. Like I see the IV and CLM, they have like the same color. Like then what is the relation between these two categories? And then if you have like introduce a new event, how do you put the new event to which category? How do you define that?
I would guess that is just a lack of colors actually, or something like that. That IV and CLM has the same color. I don't think that's really intended, honestly. And the same for announcement and flow context definition down there. We also have the same color, which is a bit strange to me, at least. And that, I mean, it just reveals that this is not really well structured as it is today. And I guess that's one reason for bringing it up to the community today.
I think this discussion started when we were updating references to the Toulouse edition in the sepia documentation and updated to Paris. We realized, well, you realized, Emil, that there was one of the events it was simply missing from this graph.
Issue defined, yeah.
Issue defined, yes. And then we started a discussion of where to place it, and it didn't really fit anywhere. And then we said, maybe we should talk about categorization of events, and here we are.
Exactly.
But as continue.
Also, I have a questions like so Ramm has different categorization and sepia has different categorization. So I just wondering like who make this two separate like categorization? Is like, was it based on certain like previous history or stuff like that, you know, like yeah. So I mean, I was a little bit curious on this part.
I would say it's purely historical reasons. The Ramm categorization is the initial one, I would say, which was used also in Ericsson before even open sourcing the protocol. The sepia categorization, or the whole sepia idea with the sepia, the architecture there was created when open sourcing Eiffel. So that's a more recent idea. And when creating the sepia architecture, I guess Daniel, who was mostly involved in creating this, thought it might be better to categorize things in another way, or slightly different way at least. So it's newer. I wouldn't say that it's better just because it's newer, but that's at least the history behind these two different things. I haven't really interviewed Daniel on his ideas behind this, or if he has any input, maybe we can reach out to him. I don't think he's on the call now. Or Christopher, do you have any experience or any knowledge from those days?
No.
Yeah, okay. Because I know you were quite involved with Daniel when it was open sourced as well, or maybe mostly before, but anyway.
Yeah, mostly. So I don't feel that I have a history here.
Okay. We have a lot of people on the call. Is there anyone else who has any ideas or inputs or suggestions here?
Hello, I'm Sven from Axis.
Hi.
Working next to Magnus. Coming in from left field, it looks like type categorization can be really powerful in certain contexts, but it is context dependent. So perhaps there is no point in discussing a global type categorization. Just a thought.
Yeah, that's a valid thought, of course.
Because as you can see, as it's seen from Ramm categorization and sepia categorization, they're two different right there, and there's apparently other types of categorizations. And if they are context dependent, it sort of makes it difficult to use if you have to adjust the global type categorization towards different contexts. That's my takeaway from hearing you talk about it. I don't have any deep insight myself.
So then we could consider making these categorizations totally separate and maybe even explicitly state that they are not related. Then that's a good idea, maybe.
Questions like because like in Eiffel 1, like we have categorization as well, like we have different categorization, but like since most of the events that we have in Eiffel 2 can map in back to the Eiffel 1, what's the reason that why we didn't use the old categorization method in Eiffel 1?
I would say this is actually more or less the same. The remnant categorization we see here with activities, or I think it's called jobs maybe in Eiffel 1 or in
yeah.
But then we have artifact, and we have CM, and we have test still. So those are the same categories. Then we've added some more event types to it in the open Eiffel version.
Okay.
Then the announcement and the flow context are new because those events doesn't have a really matching event in the legacy Eiffel we use. So I would say it's actually the same. It's just that we renamed the job to activity.
Yeah, that's true. I'm comparing. Yeah.
Okay, any more input? I guess this will continue. Yeah.
Hi, this is Johan Magnus, also from Axis. So I have maybe hooking on a little bit on what Sven was talking about regarding that there is maybe should be a need for more generic or customizable way of handling this with categories. And looking at the kind of the protocol today, there are similar things that are used for categorization, like flow context is a way of categorizing, and there is like a data categories for some events. So there are other things that are kind of similar, but maybe not used for this context. So maybe there are already some tries to categorize things for specific contexts. So maybe there is a need to make it a little bit more, I don't know, have a more generic or flexible way of categorizing for whatever purpose you need in your company or how you're using.
Just a comment on the flow context relation there. I think at least how we use it in Ericsson, that's a totally different dimension to it. I mean, all event types could have the same flow context, more or less. So there is no relation between these categorizations or event families and the flow context, really.
Yeah, that was kind of my point, that there are many different ways of categorizing things, and we have implemented some of them for specific scenarios, right. But maybe we should kind of do it more generic and make it possible to categorize things in one place in the protocol, but for different purposes depending on your views, so say what you need.
So maybe you suggest that we can maybe even have this family or categorization as part of the event then as well. Would that make sense? Just as we have with the flow context, or?
Yeah, something like that.
But I mean, how we use the categorization of these families today is that it's very hard coded. It's mapped the event type to the family or to the category. So it wouldn't really make sense to duplicate that information into each of the event when we anyway know from the event type what category it belongs to or family.
It would be really interesting to conceptually to use composition defined events to define groups for this way. But I don't see immediately how it could be tied back to routing keys.
I don't really see how compositions would have anything to do with categories, but maybe.
I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't explain very well. What I meant was you could use compositions to define categories if you expanded the composition defined event a little bit. It's just a small idea.
So then composition defined would be quite related to the flow context, but has just slightly different structures, or okay, that's an input as well. Good discussions. We're approaching the end of the hour. Any final comment? I guess this will continue in the community. This might be a subject for a coming monthly meeting if we see the need for it.
So 37 engineers in the room and 50 categorization opinions, sounds like.
Yeah, I get your point.